Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and thank you for joining today's lecture from wherever you are. My name is Jonathan Valdez, and I'm the Academic Program Specialist for the Center for Southeast Asian Studies here at the University of Michigan. We'll begin very shortly. We're going to let folks trickle in as we get this lecture started. And thank you all again for joining us for today's lecture with Dr. Jonathan Saha of Durham University, Racial Capitalism and Interspecies Empire in Colonial Myanmar. I would like to remind you all that this webinar is being recorded and also that attendees, viewers, cameras, microphones, and chat have been disabled for this webinar. If you have any questions for Dr. Saha, you could put those questions in the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen, and myself and our program folks will be able to take those questions and get them to Dr. Saha at the end of the talk. We've also turned on live transcriptioning, so please note that this is not always going to be accurate, but we hope this does help folks who need them. So once again, I'd like to thank you all for joining us. My name is Jonathan Valdez, and we are joined today with our featured guest lecturer for the SEAS lecture series, Dr. Jonathan Saha of Durham University. So today's event is supported with funding from the U.S. Department of Education National Resource Center Title VI grant. And I'd also like to thank our co-sponsors, the University of Michigan International Institute and the Department of Asian Language Culture for co-sponsoring today. For today's program, we'll do announcements and introductions as such, followed by Professor Saha's presentation, and then followed by a Q&A. I'd like to let you know about our upcoming events. The next one next week will be with Christina Sunardi, Magnetic Female Power in East Javanese Cross-Gender Dance Performance. The following day will also be the UM Gamelan Ensemble Spring Concert, an afternoon of Javanese music and mask dance. That will be Saturday, April 9th at 2 p.m. at the Hankinson Rehearsal Hall at the Earl V. Moore Building. And then finally, join us for our last lecture series with Hui Tam Jami of Arizona State University on, sorry for the correction of the date, that will be Friday, April 15th, 2022. From informal to digital spaces, how to shape the lived experience of network transformations in Southeast Asia. So I'm happy to welcome our lecturer for today. Dr. Jonathan Saha is an associate professor of South Asian history. He serves as faculty with the Department of History at the University of Durham. His newest book, Colonizing Animals, Interspecies Empire in Myanmar, was published this past year. So his talk will focus on how colonized people's relationships with animals changed in Myanmar under British rule. And he'll also speak on how notions of race became more prominent in politics and culture, especially during the interwar years, and also how they coincide with commoditization of animals and the racializations of human difference. So please help me in giving a warm welcome to Professor Jonathan Saha.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. I'm also now going to share my screen, and so hopefully that will work okay. There we go. I believe you should be all able to see that now. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak to you all. I had hoped to perhaps do something a bit more ambitious than what I'm going to do today, but have scaled back my talk, partly because having submitted my title and my abstract, I realized that it may appear to some as little more than a group of jargon terms lumped together, which don't necessarily tell you very much about what it is I'm doing. And so I'm going to talk you through the project that was the book and the direction that that's now going, which is where this concept of racial capitalism comes into it. So it might be a bit more schematic, but I will try and give you some material details of the types of histories that I'm interested in exploring towards the end. So why interspecies empire? Well, what does interspecies empire itself mean? And so my book, Colonizing Animals, which came out last year, looks at the history of British Burma, or what is today Myanmar. And I originally started off trying to write an animal history of British colonialism in the region. but quickly found that it was a history that could only ever be partial, based on which creatures were appearing in the archives, which animals were most pertinent to the imperial plans or commercial operations or to anti-colonial movements. And so rather than thinking of it as an animal history, it became apparent to me that it was more of a history of the relationships between different species, particularly, but not exclusively, between humans and non-human animals. And this focus on the relationships between the two of them, rather than a focus on animals as agents within history, was also something of a comment on the state of the field within animal history itself, that had tended to try and recover the experiences, the agency of non-human animals, but often at the expense of being attuned to the histories of colonized people that lived alongside and worked with those animals. Some of this failure to engage with that connected history between colonized peoples and animals resulted from a methodological assumption that we could use the same archival methods and literary techniques of analysis and recovery for recuperating the history of subaltern people, human people, as we could for animals. And what I argue in the book is, in fact, we do require different approaches to the archives to understand the lives of humans and to understand the lives of animals. And some of the reasons for that will become apparent as I go through my talk today. But a simple answer to that question to foreshadow what's to come is that they were subject to quite different historical forces during colonialism. As a result, they were encoded in the archive in different ways, and our critical apparatus for understanding the histories that affected them are needed to be different. Those differences, however, can be partially overcome by understanding the two through a history of the relationship between humans and animals. And that's why my book focused on what I called Interspecies Empire. Now that figures from the start imperialism as an inherently interspecies process. And this comes from the, I think, undeniable ubiquity of animals as important factors and agents within the history of the British imperialism, at least, but I think for many different imperial formations. In Myanmar, from those early interactions with the British, creatures like elephants were hugely important, if not pivotal, in warfare, in the establishment of state logistics, and just the operation of colonial power. Other creatures, such as mosquitoes, had profound effects on how colonialism operated, spreading sickness and emerging out of changed ecologies. If we trace that right the way through to the final years of British colonialism, at the point of the Japanese occupation of Myanmar, what we see is animals becoming hugely troublesome and problematic creatures in colonial writings as Yangon fell to the Japanese. And we have orangutans being found in upmarket apartment complexes attacking incoming soldiers, black panthers apparently stalking the streets, and crocodiles escaping into what were previously pleasure gardens. So animals punctuate and mark the history of British colonialism in Myanmar throughout the period. Those are some quite vivid ways, but the image which I've put on here identifies a much more sort of everyday, commonplace importance of animals. This is a a picture from the Empire Marketing Board made in the late 1920s. It was designed and painted by a Burmese artist called Ba Nhan, and it displays a paddy field, the threshing of paddy. And central to the image is the white oxen, nicely sort of complementing the white pagoda further down into the background. And this type of image is sort of pastoral scene of Burmese agriculture always contains the oxen in there. And there's two reasons for this sort of interwar art to place the animals so central. One is that they were essential to the rice industry itself. As we'll see, around 4 million buffalo and oxen migrated from the upper parts of Myanmar into the Irrawaddy Delta to enable the great transformation of what was previously a largely mangrove forested backwater of pre-colonial authority into becoming the largest rice producing region in the world by the late 1920s, 1930s. So they were pivotal to that material transformation. But also the image of the Burmese peasant working with the oxen produced a sense of harmonious relations in the countryside, at least in the artworks and the photographs taken through imperial lenses. But this, of course, belied a much more troublesome and much more fraught set of social relations within that world that ultimately resulted in 1930 with one of the largest rebellions against British rule that was witnessed within British India. So this interspecies empire that I hope I've illustrated, at least in outline to you just then, led me to make two particular arguments about what forces were changing the relationship between colonized people and animals. The first is what I term animal capital, and that is the rendering of particular species into important forms of capital within specific productive processes. Here we have an image, a postcard from the 1920s of an elephant being lifted onto a ship. And elephants were essential to one particular major industry in Myanmar, which is a timber industry. Indeed, elephants and the acquisition of elephant capital was probably pivotal to the competitive edge that large imperial timber firms were able to gain over smaller Burmese outfits. As easy to access teak in Myanmar's forests became depleted, timber firms had to go further and further into the forests to try and recover teak. And in order to do that, there was no better creature than an elephant that could help with the felling of the animal, the felling of the teak, the transportation of the teak, the removal of it from rivers. They can even swim. And so when they're moving down, when the logs are moving through the rivers down to the ports, elephants can be used to dislodge them when they become bundled up. And then the stacking, the processing of teak in the ports itself was also work which was done by elephants. But the capital that was expended in order to enable the mobilization of this elephant workforce, which grows from around 1,000 working elephants in 1900 through to estimates between 7,000 and 10,000 working elephants by 1940. The capital which was expended on these elephants is only possible for these big European firms that have this ability to raise those levels of funds. And so one of the most important transformations that happens to elephants as a species in Myanmar is their conversion into capital. And this sees them move from being mostly a wild species to being predominantly a captive or semi-captive species during this time. And because of the nature of the conditions under which elephants lived in those semi-captive states, they were not able to reproduce that workforce from within the own captive herds, but were constantly drawing from the wild populations in order to maintain that level of work. And so by the end of the colonial period, the survival of elephants as a species in Myanmar becomes increasingly connected to their continuing presence in the workforce of timber extraction industries. There are a number of other species that are also transformed into a form of capital in this time period, oxen being a crucial one, as I've mentioned before, in a very different type of industry, one in which primary producers still retain control of their modes of production for the most part, their means of production for the most part, in the rice industry. So this is peasant production of rice, and oxen and buffalo being essential in those processes. So colonized peoples' relationships with these major species, these important species in these dominant industries in colonial Myanmar, their relationships are predominantly transformed by the emergence of capitalism and by the emergence of a market society. The other set of forces or contexts in which humans' relationships or colonized people's relationships with animals really change is in the anti-colonial struggle. So in this context, we see colonizers using animals to justify and bolster racial hierarchies and social hierarchies. So Burmese people's proximity or relationships with animals were used as evidence of their civilizational backwardness in relationship to British culture. Now, this took an unusual form in Myanmar, or at least a contrary form to how Indian relationships with animals were seen. Indians were seen to be barbaric and cruel to their animals. Burmese were seen to be overly sympathetic. And so this would come down to sort of apocryphal stories of Burmese women breastfeeding orphaned creatures and orphaned animals, such as bears and even elephants, to the unwillingness of Burmese people to participate in the slaughter of animals or the consumption of animals. So these things in the imperial mindset were evidence of the underdeveloped nature of Burmese society and the superstitious nature of religious practice and cultural belief. There was an anti-colonial reaction to some of these discourses and a subversion of some of these discourses. And animals were increasingly used in the repertoire of Burmese nationalism as both symbols and as material objects that they were concerned with. Now, some of this came out of a reformist Theravada Buddhist politics, which saw a desire to preserve the teachings of the Buddha through reforming the practices of Burmese Buddhist people themselves. And this meant an encouragement of from monks and anti-colonial nationalists for the laity to abstain from consuming meat, particularly cows, and to treat animals in a more humane way. So the treatment of animals itself became an important plank within Burmese activism. There were also important symbols. Peacocks, for instance, were and remain important political symbols within Burmese culture and political culture. But we also got very interesting and exciting anti-colonial thinkers engaging with animals in ways that subverted and engaged with colonial forms of knowledge. The image I've put on the slide here is of the cover of something called the Monkey Teaker, written by a very important Burmese anti-colonial nationalist thinker, writer, and journalist, poet as well, called Thakin Kodormine, although in this instance he's writing under the name Mr. Mountmine. And this is one of the things he does, is to try and imitate, replicate English cultural forms in order to lampoon them and satirize them. So he's doing that with his name in this particular authored text, and he does it throughout the text in a variety of ways. One of the things which I found really interesting, and I talk about in the book, is the way he uses natural history knowledge to draw comparisons between the behaviors and the physical appearance of monkeys and apes, and make comparisons between those apes and Englishmen. Say how certain monkeys had hairstyles that made it look like the bowl cut and sideburns of English gentlemen in the 1920s. So here you can see him playing with notions of civilization and proximity to evolutionary ancestors in order to satirize colonial society in a variety of ways. So animals are, I hope to show, really important in some anti-colonial thinking, or strands of anti-colonial thinking in colonial Myanmar in the 20s and 30s. So these two themes are really central in my book. And where I'm trying to bring racial capitalism into this is that I think it actually talks to the intersection of these two forces that I see transforming the lives of colonized people and their relationships with animals. So racial capitalism itself, it has struck me in preparing for this talk, is probably not a particularly transparent term. And indeed, some of the writing on it treats it in different ways. I think there's a particular problem or difficulty with the term in that it both connotes an approach and connotes a historical phenomenon. So the approach, which is more what I'm interested in, that it's said to connote, is a way of trying to understand the emergence of market societies or the emergence of capitalist relationships in such a way as to be constantly alert to the way that those new social formations were attenuated, attuned to, and altered in respect to ideas of racial difference. And at the same time, in thinking about how racialization occurs, that is, how populations become understood as being defined by racial discourses, whether that be biological understandings of race or senses of race as determined by cultural, more or less fixed cultural practices, how those notions of racialization were reinforced or embedded through the emergence of capitalistic relationships. So on one level, we have an approach there. Now, some thinkers and historians have taken that to be a more or less mechanistic or large scale or causational relationship, one where they would see capitalism and racism as being inherently or perpetually in relationship with one another. I would argue for something a bit more open-ended, which is more just thinking about how the two intersect rather than trying to posit anything more definitive about the nature of the relationship between the two. But I do think that racial capitalism is, as an approach, is a very useful prompt for us to be alert to how racialization and the emergence of capitalism were in relationship with one another. Now, in terms of the phenomenon that it connotes, I think this helps us pick up on something that has often been studied about Myanmar, but never necessarily given this name. So in the 19th century and into the early 20th century, we do see the emergence of these two things, of new notions and understandings of racial difference and of a market society emerging. Now, this has often been talked about in terms of a plural society, a framework, a political economic framework, which has been in use in Southeast Asian studies for at least a century. And what I would argue is that racial capitalism gives us perhaps a better, more open-ended, more constructivist language and approach to understanding the emergence of the segmented economy according to notions of ethnic and racial difference. And I want to illustrate that through thinking about how animal capital and the racialization of national identities was emerging in colonial Myanmar. And so there are three interlinked processes, I think: the commodification of animals, the racialization of human animals, and the emergence of a market society. These sound like very big, grand statements, but hopefully I can illustrate it with some more precise examples. So the first is to talk about oxen and how they contributed to concepts and notions of indigeneity. Sorry about my coughing. Here are two images that appear in a report on the cattle stock of Myanmar published in the late 1920s. On the left-hand side, you have a young Burmese bull, purebred, and on the right-hand side, you have the evil effects of crossing, crossbred cow. Now, the crossing in this case is between, well, the so-called Indian breeds of cattle that have been introduced into Myanmar during the late 19th century and early 20th century as milking cattle to supply milk to Indian and European populations in a part of the world in which milk drinking cultures were very small prior to colonialism. The evil effects of this crossing are part of a much longer and older set of concerns dating back to the 1890s about Burmese stock of oxen being undermined by this Indian milking oxen promiscuously breeding with one another. And this concern was that it would weaken the strength of the naturally strong and hardy Burmese oxen that were required for plough in the Irrawaddy Delta. They are, however, of course, the same species of oxen. And this belief in the differences between breed here was one that was largely constructed in the late 19th century and was more of a cultural understanding than anything rooted in any meaningful biological differences between creatures that in some instances would be born, raised and brought up in regions which were not geographically very far apart, nor really different breeding stock over those centuries prior to the 19th century. So unlikely to have significant physical differences between them. Nonetheless, this was a set of beliefs which was strongly held and one that permeated beyond the British themselves and their own reports. It found its way into the Burmese nationalist press. It was there in the reports of large congresses of Burmese peasants concerned about the state of agriculture in Myanmar. And so this belief of the difference between Burmese and Indian cattle was quite widespread, and the concern about the mixing was fairly embedded. And it intersected with understandings and concerns about the difference between Burmese and Indian people, between indigenous groups and foreign groups, that are very much part of the heart of Burmese nationalist debates in the 1920s and 30s. It's not very easy to tell from the image, but the left-hand image of the young Burmese bull is attended by a Burmese man, and the crossbred bull showing the ill effects is attended by an Indian man. So the difference between the cattle is also being used to reinforce a sense of difference and foreignness and indigeneity within the human populations that attend to these creatures. There is much more that could be said about how this then plays out into anti-Indian violence, anti-Indian politics in the 1920s and 30s. But it's a nice illustration, I think, at least, of how the commoditization of oxen and notions of racial difference can be seen to be playing out. A second example is with elephants and notions of ethnicity. Here I have a photo taken from a book published in 1950, but the photograph is taken from the 1930s, called Elephant Bill, which is written by a man called James Williams, who was a supervisor of elephant camps for the Bombay Burma Trading Corporation, a large teak extraction firm operating in Myanmar, or at least teak was the major operations that that particular firm had in Myanmar. And the caption to the image describes inseparable. The young Uzi is almost part of his animal. They are both about the same age, 21. He is Shan with pale copper skin, and the elephant has pig edges to its ears and trunk contrasting with its blue-black hide. So the physicality of the two, the connections between the two, is really what is trying to be emphasized with this image. But it also speaks to some of the employment relations and economic niches that were carved out for ethnic minority groups in the borderland regions where the teak industry was really operating. And within the records of the Bombay Burma Trading Corporation, you can see the importance of their awareness of what's happening in the Kachin regions bordering Assam, in the north west of Myanmar, and the Karen regions in the east of Myanmar, trying to work out where they're going to buy elephants from, the relative difference in prices of elephants, and the cost of labor in those regions to find people who will attend to those elephants. Now, often in colonial writings, you have this belief that these populations have passed on elephant knowledge generation to generation over centuries. And while there is certainly a clear lineage in elephant knowledge that has been generated and is operating in Karen and Kachin populations, among other ethnic minority groups, that story belies the fact that because you're going from a population of around 1,000 working elephants through to 10,000 working elephants in the space of around 30 years, there has to be a large number of people who are brought into this type of labor for the first time and have to be acquiring this type of knowledge. So this somewhat romanticized view of ethnic minority groups' relationships with animals is actually missing a whole process by which Karen and Kachin populations are now finding a new economic niche in attending to and training and working with elephants in the colonial period, cementing a relationship between them as groups and this particular species. And you can see, particularly in the 1920s, this being picked up on by some elite members of those ethnic minority groups. A particularly redolent example would be of a prominent Karen loyalist politician called San Krombi Po, who through his relationship with a Karen elephant capturing company, discovers a white elephant, but they then use in the Wembley exposition in London in 1928 and in 1926, and then goes on to a global tour demonstrating Karen loyalty for within the British Empire in 1928 onwards. So you have minority groups mobilizing this relationship with elephants to further their own political aims as well. That's not happening in a widespread way, but it is an example of the ways in which the commoditization of elephants is feeding in to an extent to the racialization of minority groups within the country itself. So there are many other areas that I could have picked up on and that I'm really interested in further exploring, particularly the relationship between whiteness and horses that becomes a point of tension in the early 20th century as well. But for the time that I have, I hope that these two illustrate why I think racial capitalism might help us understand the relationship between animals being turned into capital and the emergence of anti-colonial struggles. I'm aware of time and wanting to give people the opportunity to ask me questions about what has been a rather schematic and sketch of a lecture. But until then, I hope this has been sufficient in giving you a little taste of what focusing on the relationship between animals and colonized people can do for telling new histories of colonialism in Myanmar. Thank you for listening.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Saha. As we wait for Q&A to come, so please use that Q&A function on the bottom of your screen to get some questions for Dr. Saha. We'll have our comment moderators there for you to get these answered. So I think something that you had brought up is like a question in food studies that I think was brought up by Melanie DePriest in regards to who decides what we get to eat and such. I think a question that I'm thinking of in thinking about the relationships between oxen, like native oxen, and imported British ideas of oxen. Were there changes of relationships of what meat could be eaten in Burmese culture versus what happens after British hegemony takes control, I guess, of what is considered edible?
Yeah, certainly there are changes and there are tensions around what's edible and what's not. Milk is an interesting one. There is no strong pre-existing milk consumption culture, and I know that's not animal flesh, but it's an animal secretion. What we have there is something of an engagement with an attempt to encourage the consumption of milk as a health providing product, particularly for the rearing of children. So it goes from something which is not very common to something which is sort of promoted in a variety of ways. But what's interesting, I find interesting about the way that it's promoted is it's rarely promoted with images of oxen. It's mostly promoted with images of a healthy Burmese family with children running around. And the animal remains somewhat removed from the advertising of it. And on the flip side of that, if you like, is concerns over the consumption of beef and the emergence of cow protection movements around trying to protect and discourage the consumption of cow flesh, which is not something which is entirely new in the colonial period, but does take on new political meanings in that moment. There is certainly likely to be exposure to a greater range of meat consumption in the colonial period. Certainly attempts to regulate the consumption and production of meat in new ways, and according to new scientific strictures. And some of that also gets organized by notions of racial difference. So Chinese populations and Indian Muslim populations being favored in the licensing of slaughterhouses in the colonial period, being an example of that. The raising of pigs and the cultivation of pigs being something that was often done by Chinese populations in the Delta, at least. So you even there in that new culture of meat consumption, you can still see a process of racialization attached to it.
Awesome. Well, now we have about 4 questions in queue. So I'll just go through from the top. Michael Miller thanks you for the presentation, but he would also like to see if a quick taste of those connections between horses and whiteness that you mentioned at the end.
So, yeah, it's a really interesting one. So it's come out of my reading of a few sort of colonial bits of literature, but also tracking the lives of some elite Burmese actors in the late 19th century, early 20th century. And one of those areas of trying to demonstrate cultural competence, as we might call it, is the ability to own, but also basically be able to assess good quality horses to be used for your carriages, for going around, as well as to be able to engage with the sociality of the horse race. Maybe buy a horse or get in to be able to gamble on horse in the etiquette and the knowledge of horse racing. And so there's a particular very prominent Arakanese legal thinker and later lawyer called Chantun, who his career is amazing in many ways, but he marries a white British woman and moves to Yangon. The marriage goes horribly wrong. They divorce, and after he dies, she writes a pretty horrible account of their marriage. And one of the turning points in the narrative is when she realizes that he isn't actually capable of behaving and being like a European, because he buys this terrible horse and he can't get himself into debt over this terrible horse. And it exposes his lack of ability to actually become this figure of elite imperial society that he so desperately wishes to be. So that's just a little taste of it. But you can also see in sort of middle class Burmese household manuals sections on how best to look after and treat a horse, which draws upon European manuals on looking after stables and being able to assess the quality of horses. So yeah, so whiteness and horses and aspirational elite people in Myanmar is where I see horses playing into some of that. Thanks for the question, or the opportunity to talk a bit more, I should say.
The next question comes from Manish Mehta. They're asking, what role did Indian businessmen play in the commoditization of animals, citing that there's mostly businessmen coming from Gujarat and Rajasthan?
So there are sort of indirect ways in which this is playing out, which is through money lending. So there you have Chettiar money lenders in Myanmar who are lending money, and people are mostly attuned to the way that they're lending money in order to enable people to have the credit to start working on land and eventually acquire the land themselves. But some of the money which they're lending, a fair proportion of the money which they're lending, is also for cattle. And cattle are also a large reason why people default on loans. They're susceptible to all sorts of diseases and susceptible to predation. And so part of the concern is around that. And so moneylenders, in some instances, do start to acquire cattle themselves and lend it. And so people will rent cattle from people who have acquired capital in the countryside, large proportion of which are from India proper. Then those sort of cattle herders, whether we describe them as businessmen or not, is, I think, perhaps more a question of what groups we're trying to connote with that particular language. But certainly they are owners of large cattle herds, but then they're not especially wealthy individuals, and their migration to Myanmar is sometimes seasonal, but they are a site of concern, as I've already identified. Other Indian businessmen and others may well be using elephants and oxen and buffalo sort of as ancillary to their enterprises, as transport, as sort of elements of working labor in a productive process, but perhaps not to the extent to which that they would be sort of causing attention. And the primary set of tensions or concerns around oxen are around moneylenders, people who own large numbers of oxen, milking herds, and of course slaughter and the ownership of slaughterhouses, or the licensing of slaughterhouses, or at least from the records and the archives that I've been primarily engaging with.
Awesome. The next question comes from Eric White, and he's asking, to what degree did racialized capitalism in colonial Myanmar account for and play upon differences between various ethnic racial groups within the colony, particularly regarding majority Burmans and minority others?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And I think it's one which is perhaps not been explored quite as much as it should. And so I think where we get the nearest to people engaging with racialized capitalism over the last few years, it has been on that rift between Burmese populations and Indian populations, some of which we must acknowledge would have been in the colony for generations, and some of whom were migratory. So that Indian population itself being quite differentiated and not entirely foreign, some of whom may well have been indigenous. We must be careful of not reifying that separation too much. But there are certainly also these divisions emerging between Burman or Burma majority populations and minority populations that are attenuated by capitalism and by the sort of economic niches that people are finding themselves into. So let's look again at the Bombay-Burma Trading Corporation and its employment of Karen populations. And you can see this playing out in one of the sort of key moments in Burmese colonial history, the Siasan Rebellion of 1930, where you have this massive Burmese peasant uprising. One of the things which is often less picked up on about that are the ethnic tensions between Burma populations and minority groups. I mean, there are a load of attacks on Chin populations that I have not seen any writing on at all, but there are attacks and standing fights between Karen populations and Burmese populations, Burman populations in this time. And some of that is because the timber firms used, or their employees and their connections with the Karen populations in the upland areas, to organize their own levies of fighters against the rebels. And they do so because they don't believe that the state, the colonial state, is going to offer the commercial industry enough support off their own back. But what it demonstrates is this growing cleavage is partly emerging through the commercial and economic niches that are being carved out of those extractive industries. And as a result, the employment relations, but also the social and cultural relations that are formed from those that are reinforcing those divisions. And in a moment like the Sai San Rebellion and the use of Karen fighters in that, it then leans into what happens into the 1930s and the further engagement and deepening of racialized capitalism in that particularly tumultuous decade.
Awesome. Our next question comes from Mike McGovern. He is asking, with the understanding that you're a historian, I wonder if you have any thoughts about the ways that relations amongst indigeneity, ethnicity, and animals operate in the recent past compared to the relations in the first half of the 20th century that you have studied. And he's asking that in respect because he's from the anthropology department here at UMichigan.
Yeah, so it's a good question. And I guess I was sort of hinting at this being an area that needs more exploration, because the notion that these elephant knowledges in particular are very much embedded and rooted within these whether it's Karen or Kachin cultures, I think does need more historical unpacking and thinking through. Because whichever way you cut it, there are far more elephant drivers, more people involved in the lives of elephants now, in commercial operations certainly, but any sort of captive elephants, than there was prior to colonialism. And so there is going to be a period of time of sort of the emergence or the greater transmission of knowledges, experiential and cultural, and about animals, new ways of being with animals that are being forged in this time. The work of Jacob Schell, I think, is really interesting for this. Who's written particularly about Kachin relationships with elephants today. And one of his arguments is that the most prominent legacies of the growth of new human-elephant relationships in the 19th century and early 20th century is not actually their deployment in the timber industry, but their deployment in what he calls subversive logistics, their ability to traverse very difficult forms of terrain in all sorts of different time periods. And that is one which might be a continuous history that we can trace from this period through to today, that remains a crucial part of relations between ethnic minority groups and elephants in particular. I know that's quite a narrow way of answering your question. It might not fully get to what it is you're hoping to hear from me. But I guess what I'm saying is that there is likely to be a large amount of cultural change that we haven't explored yet, or historians haven't really engaged with yet. But within that, we might be able to see a continuous line in some of the material uses of animals, particularly elephants, from the late 19th century through to today, particularly around logistics and transportation.
Awesome. We have two last questions, one from Justin and one from Thomas. So the first question is going to be, do you find that the ethnicization of the elephant also extends to the ways elephants that are still in the wild are talked about, or was it only the case with captive elephants that were perceived to have this close relationship with their uzis? And then the last question will be, what about fish consumption? Are there cultural differences post the colonial with Burma and the British?
So on the first point, as elephants' habitats disappear or change during the late 19th century, 20th century, through the huge expansion of rice paddy, the association between wild elephant populations and the indigenous populations of the hill regions get stronger. And that might be indirectly through a sense of what those ecologies are like, or through sort of romanticized literature about these wild spaces. But wild elephants, as their own mobility and movement gets more limited, become more strongly associated with those populations. In colonial writings, and I would hesitate to say whether that goes any deeper into the cultures themselves. In terms of fish consumption, what seems to be the case is actually, rather than it being a story of change, maybe a story of expanded consumption as infrastructure changes and as the market takes different forms in the colonial period. But at least in colonial writings, it would seem that the writings are more identifying a stubbornness to Burmese consumption practices, particularly around something like fermented fish paste, nga pe, which is something which the British are not very happy about. First of all, in sort of culinary terms, they don't like it. It's not to their taste, but they're really concerned about it in terms of a sanitary concern, a hygiene concern. But they can't stamp it out. They largely find that a lot of fish consumption they would like to regulate more, but changing Burmese culinary practices is something that they seem more frustrated about. I would caveat all that with this being not something I've looked in great depth, but what I'm recalling here is just the bits of reports and bureaucratic correspondence that I have picked up on. So that's my impression of it.
Awesome. And with that, I'd like to thank Dr. Saha again for joining us today. And thank you all for taking your time on this Friday afternoon or Friday evening or Friday morning or Saturday morning, wherever you are, for joining this wonderful talk. So once again, thank you all. And we hope to see you all again at our next lecture. So you all have a wonderful day. Oh, and you can find this wonderful lecture and the conversation with Dr. Saha on our YouTube channel in the forthcoming weeks. So thank you again and have a wonderful day.